How's it going, everyone? This week's video is a crash course on how to get a headless WordPress setup with WPGraphQL and create React app. This is going to be a high-level course that just goes over how to get a simple setup. This is not anything that's seriously going to be production ready or anything like that, but it should give you a really good idea on how to get WordPress up and running with GraphQL, making it feed data to a React app, and getting a React app set up to accept that data and then display it. So there's a lot of exciting stuff in here. I definitely learned a lot making it. I hope you do too. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell to make sure you get notified of my weekly WordPress tutorials. All right, let's get started. All right, so before we jump into anything with React, we're going to make sure that our quote-unquote headless WordPress setup is good to go. Now, we're not going to deep dive into this, but we are going to do the basics here. The first thing that we're going to make sure that we have is a few plugins that we're going to be utilizing. The first plugin, and probably the most important plugin, is the WPGraphQL plugin. This is a plugin that's going to allow us to hit the GraphQL endpoint from our React app and read data from WordPress. Likewise, we're going to be using advanced custom fields to store that data, so we will need a third plugin, WPGraphQL for advanced custom fields, to marry those two plugins together. And then lastly, we're going to be using WPGraphQL, which is a IDE that allows us to make GraphQL queries right from our WordPress dashboard. So let's go ahead and activate all of those. So once we've activated those, we now have access to a new endpoint. If we go to wpgraphql.local, which is the site that I set up, /GraphQL, we will get this error message, but that really means that it's working and that things are set up properly. If we go back to our dashboard down at the bottom left, we should get a graphical menu item that if we click on, should take us to something that looks like this. This tool allows us to create and test GraphQL queries before we copy and paste them into our React app, making our lives a lot easier and not having to debug things with console logs and all that. So what we're going to do is we're going to just take a look at a couple of test queries. And since this isn't a tutorial about GraphQL itself, I'm going to kind of breeze through the explanations. But I should mention over here on the right, we have the Documentation Explorer. And if we click on the root query, we can see all the things that we can kind of mess with, all the things that are available to us from that WPGraphQL plugin out of the box. So we can query media items, we can query menus, we can query pages and posts. And just to make sure things are working, let's query some pages. And we're going to get the edges and then the node. And then we are going to get the title. So if we run that, we can get an object back that gives us the title of the pages. We can add more fields in there. We can autocomplete or trigger the autocomplete by hitting Control Spacebar. And then we can get the content of that post and hit run. And then we get the content of that sample page. So we can get pretty much everything that we could imagine inside of here. So now we also get the date. And so what we're going to do is, since we're not really too worried about pages in this project, we're going to be working with a custom post type called toasters. However, if we were to try and look through here for toasters, we're not getting anything, and we don't have anything in our root query for toasters. And so what we're going to have to do is get GraphQL to recognize a custom post type of toasters. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to set up that custom post type. And the second thing we're going to do is get that custom post type into GraphQL. So let's jump over to our code here. We're going to go into WP Content Themes 2019 because that's the theme I have activated. And then our functions.php. If we go all the way to the bottom, I'm going to copy and paste this guy in here, so you don't have to watch me type it out. But all I'm doing is registering a new post type. making it public, giving it a label. However, there are three new arguments that we need to pass here. Showing GraphQL, which we're going to be setting to true, the GraphQL single name, and the GraphQL plural name. So these three are the things that will allow us to actually use it in GraphQL. If we don't have these, it won't work. So make sure you get these guys in there. So let's hit save and go back to our dashboard, hit refresh, and now we have toasters. So if we click on toasters, we have toaster 1 and toaster 2, which I have set up beforehand. And then now we can go to GraphQL and we can start typing toaster, and we get a couple different toaster options. So if we query toasters, and we get the edges, the node, and the title, we can run this. And now we get back an object that has toaster 1 and toaster 2. The next thing that we need to do is make sure that we can query for our advanced custom fields, because as of right now, that's not set up. So what we're going to do is we're going to go over to advanced custom fields down here using the custom fields menu item. And we're going to create a new field group, and we're going to call this toaster meta. The first thing that we're going to do in here is make sure that this only is showing up on the toaster's custom post type. And if we scroll down to the very bottom here, we need to check this toggle button, show in GraphQL. We're going to need to toggle that to yes. And then the GraphQL field name. That's what we're going to be referring to this field group name in GraphQL. And we're going to call this toaster meta. And then let's add a couple of fields to this just real quick. The first one is going to be price. And then the second one is going to be called watts. Those are the two most important things you want to know when you are buying a toaster, right? The other thing that we need to make sure is that showing GraphQL is checked inside of here. So you can toggle them on and off individually per field inside of the field group. So let's hit publish, and then let's go back to graphical. And then inside of here, we should now have toaster meta, which we did not have before. But now we can open this up and get price, and we can get watts. If we hit run, we now get price and watts inside of our data structure here. And since we just created it, we don't have values for those. So let's hurry up and get those taken care of. So for toaster 2, we are going to say it's 400 and 800 watts. Hit update. We go to toaster 1. We say 500 and 850 watts. Hit update. We can go back to graphical. We can hit run, and voila, we now get those values. And so now that we have a simple API up and running, we can now move on to the React portion of our site. So let's jump back over to our code here, and we're going to close out of functions.php and collapse our WordPress site folder. We're going to open up our terminal here, and if you have Node and npm installed, you should be able to run npx create React app. And then we're going to call this toaster review site, and we're just going to hit enter. And once it's done, we can cd into toaster review site and run yarn start. So once that's done, we should have a localhost set up that we can then start using. If we go back to our browser, we now have localhost 3000 with a very familiar homepage here. And that means everything is up and running. So let's jump back over to our code and get some dependencies installed. So these are the dependencies that we're going to be working with. First is GraphQL for obvious reasons. The second is GraphQL tag, which is a template literal that will help us turn a string into a GraphQL query. React Apollo is a GraphQL client specifically for React. Apollo Boost gives us some sensible defaults that give us basically all the default things you would install anyway, and just makes it so we have to give it a URL to hit, and then that's it. The next thing and last thing is React Router DOM, which is just going to allow us to switch back and forth between pages in React. So we're going to have like a /toasters route, and then a /toaster/ toaster slug route, and we're going to be able to navigate back and forth between those thanks to that. So let's get these installed, and then we can get into the fun stuff. What we can do is copy and paste this into our terminal to get all of those packages in there, but I've done that behind the scenes. So all I'm going to do is run yarn start to get our local host up and running again. So then I'm going to close out of our terminal here, and we're going to open up our toaster review site folder, which is now alongside of our WordPress site, and go into the source folder and open up app.js. And we're going to get rid of these imports here at the top and everything that's inside of this return, so we can kind of start from scratch here. So let's import some of those packages that we just mentioned a second ago. We're going to get the Apollo client from Apollo Boost, and you'll see in just a second how easy it is to set up this thanks to Apollo Boost. Apollo Provider, which is going to wrap our application, and then our browser router and routes so we can swap back and forth between pages. However, the first thing that I want to do is get our Apollo client set up, and that's going to look something like this. We're going to create a new variable called client, and we're going to new up an Apollo client, and we're going to pass it an object that has a URI in it. And this URI should look pretty familiar. We are looking for the GraphQL endpoint of our WordPress install. So now every time that we make a GraphQL query, it's going to be using this endpoint. And like I just said, we need to wrap our entire application in this Apollo provider. And this Apollo provider takes in a client. And we just created this client right here, so we're going to pass it in right here. The next thing that we need to do is get the browser router, and we need to wrap our application in that as well. So once we have those two things in here, everything else inside of here is going to be pretty default. So let's get started with kind of creating a basic layout of our page. So I'm going to copy and paste this in here, and it's just a basic div with a header and a div with a class name of content. And this is where we're going to be putting all of our routes to load in our components. So let's get those guys in there. And we're just going to be working with 3 routes today. It's just going to be the home page, and we're going to be loading in the toasters component. Then we're going to work with /toasters, and again, the toasters component, and then the single page for a toaster, which will match /toaster and then the slug of that toaster. And we will load in the toaster component. So let's go ahead and get those guys in here. So we haven't set these up yet, but let's just get the import ready to go. So that way, when we do make them, everything will just work. So let's start by creating the toasters component. So we're going to open it up here, and we're going to create a new folder called toasters. And inside of there, we're going to create a new file called toasters.js. We're going to want to import a few things here. First, we're going to want to import React, obviously. The next thing we're going to want to import is the query component from React Apollo, which we'll go over. We're going to want to use the GraphQL tag inside of that query component, so we're going to want to have that imported as well. And then lastly, since this is going to be on the home page, we're going to want to be able to link from a toaster that we display to its single page. So with those, let's now create the actual component itself. So we're going to create a new variable here called toasters, and that's going to be equal to a function here. Just do an arrow function and have the implicit return. And inside here, this is where we're going to actually be doing our query. So we will have our entire component being wrapped inside of this query. And inside this query, it takes a query. And this is where we're going to be using that GraphQL tag. So we're going to have GQL, and then we're going to have those backticks. And inside of these backticks is where we are going to be writing our GraphQL query. So this is where we will go back to WordPress to figure out what that looks like. So back to WordPress, we have that query that we were working with a little bit earlier. Now, we're not going to want this toaster meta. All we're really going to want is something very basic, like the title and the slug. We're going to want to say what the toaster is, and then we're going to want to use this to construct a link to that toaster here in a minute. So let's hit the run button and just make sure that we're getting what we want, which we are. So let's grab this and head back to React here and paste that in and format a little bit. And with this is really the beginnings of using GraphQL inside of React. So next step is to actually consume this data. So since the query component gives us, it kind of uses the render prop pattern, it gives us an object that we can use to render our data that comes back from this query. So all we have to do is open up some curly brackets here. And then what we're going to do is just going to have a function. And inside this function, we're going to have three things that we're going to pull out of it. We're going to get the loading, we're going to get the error, and we're going to get the data. And with those three things, we can create our component. So the first thing that we're going to do is let's just make sure that we're actually getting what we think we're getting. So let's console log data, and let's make sure that we return something so we don't get an error. So let's just, put a p tag here and say hello. And one thing that we forgot to do is export this. So let's make sure that we export default toasters. And let's go back to our React app here. And we've got an object here. So we've got toasters. Let's see if we can zoom in a little bit down here. We've got toasters, edges, and then we've got two items in the array here. The first one has a node in it, which has slug and title, which is toaster2. And then obviously the other one is toaster1. So we can start to use this data to populate our toaster review site archive page. So let's go back. And what we'll need to do is we will need to, first of all, make sure that if we are loading, that we don't do any sort of return. So that way we're not getting any errors. So if we're loading, return, an H1 that says loading, ... And then if it's not loading, we can safely start to use the stuff that we found inside of data. So what we're going to do is we're going to map over it. So let's start by clearing out this return. And let's give ourselves a div tag to work with inside of here, just so we're returning a single element. And then we're going to have to open up some curly brackets, and we're going to be starting off with data.toasters.edges.map. So we're following the same structure here that we have up here. So what we want to do is we want to map over the edges, and we're going to take in toaster and key. And we're going to have a function that is going to return some HTML or some JSX, I should say. And we're going to have another div. And this is where we're going to actually output the data of our toaster. And since we're inside of a map, we need to give it a key, a unique key. So let's just take the key that is coming from the map. And then what we'll do is we'll take an H2 or something like that. And we can use some curly brackets and output toaster.node.title. So hopefully you start to see the connection there. So we've got toaster that was passed in by map, and we're getting node.title up here. So node.title right here. So the way that we're getting this data back matches exactly how we asked for it. So another really important feature from GraphQL. So the last thing that we're going to do is, well, actually before we do that, let's just double check to make sure this is looking good. So let's go back to our browser here, and we have toaster2 and toaster1. So everything's looking good that way. However, this isn't super useful. So let's make it so you can actually go to an individual toaster page. So what we're going to do is, since we've already imported the link component, we're just going to take it and make a new link to /toaster/ the slug of that toaster with some text about saying learn more. So let's save that, go back, and it's going to be loading for a second. And once it's done loading, we should get 2 learn more buttons that each link to their respective page. But once we click it, we're not really getting much. So we have to actually set up that individual toaster. So now that this is done, let's set that up. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back to our file tree here. We're going to create a new file under our toasters folder called toaster.js. And what we're going to do is we're going to import a few other things here. We're going to import React, component from React, the GraphQL tag again, and a GraphQL higher order component from React Apollo. And this is going to be set up a little bit differently. So this is going to be a little bit more complicated. I'm going to try and explain it the best that I can, but this is the part that kind of tripped me up the most. So hang tight. The first thing that we're going to do is create a new class called toaster that extends component. And we're going to have a render inside of here, like you do. And we're going to make sure that we get our props. And from this.props. And eventually we're going to start console logging them. So let's just make sure that we get that in there right now. And let's just make sure that we return something for now. That way React doesn't yell at us. And instead of exporting this by default, this is how you normally would do it. What we're going to do is we're going to actually export a GraphQL higher order component, and then we're going to have it call this toaster component. I know that's a little bit confusing, but I'm going to take you through it step by step. So instead of toaster, we're going to be using that GraphQL higher order component that I was just talking about. And it takes a couple different arguments. The first one here is going to be a query. So query goes here, and then it's going to take an object with some options in it. So let's set up this query first. And so what we're going to want is to go back to WordPress and get this query set up. So we're going to delete what we used to have there. And we're going to type query. And we're going to name this query get toaster by slug. And this query is going to take one argument called slug. That's going to be a string. So we're going to make sure it's typed. That's something that's important. And when it returns, we want it to come back into a toaster object here. And what we're going to do is we're going to do toaster by. So this gets automatically created when we set up the custom post type, and thanks to WPGraphQL. So what we can do is we want to query the toaster by the URI, and we're going to take the slug that we just got and insert it into here. So we're going to take that slug, and then we're going to get the title off of that toaster. And then we're going to get some toaster meta. And we're going to get the price, and we're going to get the watts. So this is the makings of a GraphQL query. So what we're going to do is we're going to copy this, and we're going to create a new constant here called get toaster by slug. And that's going to be equal to a GraphQL template string like we've used earlier. And we're going to paste that guy in there. and make sure we get a semicolon here at the end. So what we can do is we can just take this and insert it into here. So that way it just cleans it up a little bit. We could very easily just take this and paste it into here. But we now need to make sure that that variable slug gets passed into this query in the appropriate spots. So like I mentioned, this second parameter here inside of GraphQL, we can pass in some options. So we have the options key, which we are going to give a function here. And we are going to be able to get the props from our component. And thanks to React Router, we can see what is in the URL. So what we can look at and get is the slug. So const slug equals props.match.params.slug. And what we can do is use this and pass that to our query. And all we have to do is return variables with the slug. And that will give our query up here the ability to take that slug and place it in all the right spots, giving us the right data. So what this will do is we will be able to get all of our information, but we need to be able to pass that to our toaster. So since this returns a function and we can pass it toaster, and it will call this, and we should be able to get in our console log all of the data and meta that we had asked for in this query. So we should be seeing title, toaster meta, price, and watts. So fingers crossed, and let's check it out. So if we open up our console here, we got two objects. The object, if we open up data, we have toaster. And so now we have the title and the toaster meta that we can now work with. So let's come back here and swap that return out for this return, which just basically pulls that data from that toaster object and places it into a couple strong tags with a break in between. So let's save that and let's go back. And we're going to get an error actually. So what we need to do in front of this is we need to check to see if it's loading basically. So if props, there's not props.data.toaster, then we just need to return a paragraph. This is loading in it. So it says loading for a second, and then we get our information about that toaster. We can go back and we can go to toaster 1 and we get the two pieces of data about toaster 1. So this is pretty darn powerful stuff. We can actually decouple WordPress from itself and keep the data on one side and keep the front end on another, and be able to query WordPress from basically any framework that we want. This doesn't have to be React. This could be, Gatsby, or it could be Vue. It could be, 1,000 different things. So I definitely learned a lot as I was making this video. I hope you did too. If you learned something, make sure to give it a thumbs up and a comment about what you learned. And always remember to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell if you haven't already. And I will see you guys in the next one.